Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with Jenny, who's very kindly been open to being interviewed on a few topics related to autism and her experiences in her research. So the first question is actually, as I was reading through some of your previous interviews, I noticed that you mentioned coming from a very poor background. And I find that sort of financial situation is often not discussed that much, even in the neurodiversity movement. So to whatever extent you're comfortable, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, I guess, your own experiences growing up, and what barriers you experienced related to financial resources.
Yes, hi Sam. Thank you for this question because you're right. It's not a conversation that I often hear in the space of neurodiversity. So same as you. Um, I guess I'll go back to sort of my roots, where I came from, to kind of give context. So my parents, they were refugees of Vietnam who left in the 1970s and came to the United States around the late 1978, 79. They came separately and they met in the United States. Specifically, Southern California was where they met. And so they came with nothing. They literally left Vietnam with themselves, with none of their belongings. And so when they came, they, as you can guess, very poor, and had to rely on the US governmental assistance to make it in the United States. So that was how they started. And then my parents eventually met and got married and had myself and my sister. Um, and we lived on food stamps pretty much most of my early childhood. Um, and then eventually my parents had the opportunity to gain some more income and decided to move out of California to Louisiana and started a business there. They owned a gas station, grocery store. Um, and so during that period, they experienced a little bit of social mobility because they owned a business, so they made a little bit more money. But where we were situated, where they owned the business, was in a very poor community. So it was predominantly Black community, and it was in Louisiana. And we served mostly people who were living in poverty, the business. And so I'd say I grew up in poverty pretty much my entire childhood. Um, and there, I remembered being in school and that there were kids who were in special education, who lived in that same community. And they were sort of just, like doing their own thing on the side. The teachers never included them. So we never really crossed paths with those students. So I never got a chance to like get to know any of them or even make friends with them. Um, I was late diagnosed as autistic in my 30s. So during my childhood, it was so tough because I was very clearly autistic as a child, but people as in the teachers, mistaken that I was Asian and English was my second language, that maybe those were why reasons why I was socially different. I was quiet. I was in the corner. I wasn't playing with the other kids. I was stimming. That was probably a culture thing. So I was sort of ignored. Um, and so I couldn't hang out with other kids like me to even compare and realize I think we're alike in those areas. Um, I think those are some experiences I wanted to tell because um, it might resonate with other people who come from a similar background, who grew up with immigrant parents, who don't speak English fluently, become the parents' translator, at a very young age. And at the same time, they're neurodivergent and they're having to figure things out too, but their parents can't really help them figure any of it out. Um, and they can't figure it out until they get older, have access to more resources to understand why they had these marginalized experiences when they were young. That was pretty much my entire childhood.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer and background and for sharing how, I guess, yeah, the different aspects of marginalization experience and how that can lead to, I guess, if I'm understanding correctly, not being able to access um, information about being autistic or access to um, neurodivergent community at a young age. Um, the next question I have on the list is sort of related to that, maybe a bit tangentially so, but did you also see socioeconomic status as influencing or intersecting your ability to realize that you're autistic, or maybe to even like have the safety to mask or unmask autistic traits?
Yeah, I think kind of going back to what I mentioned earlier, a lot of the teachers at the schools that I attended, um, I think this is, they don't tell me this, but this is my guess, is that because they knew I was a child of immigrant parents who are not fluent in English, aren't Americans, don't have the American cultural understanding, that um, it was too much for them to take on, um, above and beyond the teacher's responsibilities that so many teachers carry, right? With very minimal resources and support, that they're not getting enough support to support students like me in the classroom. And so the easiest thing to do is sort of just let them be. I was very much a student that was ignored, kind of left on my own. I was very quiet. I I also grew up in a very abusive home. So I was conditioned to obey um, authority and not to step out of line. And so teachers are figures of authority to me. And so if they told me to do something, I'd do it without question, because I've witnessed the consequence of stepping out of line with a authority figure. And that plays into the masking a lot because I wasn't able to, I think, ever truly express myself genuinely growing up. And, children are always trying to figure themselves out. Like that's maybe even a life, like experience, trying to figure ourselves out, who we are and develop our identity. But it's so childhood and adolescence are critical periods where we're figuring those things out. And I think I never really had that opportunity because of the conditions I lived under and the context at which, um, growing up in poverty, having to assimilate in the American culture and society just so that my parents, that I can please my parents, but also because they wanted us to succeed and not be mistreated because we were different for being, you know, Asian, for being Vietnamese. And I remembered that I would have sensitivity to sounds, sensitivity to smells and touch around my family. And they would comment, all of Vietnamese, of course, like, why do you do that? That's so weird. Stop doing that. And I didn't have an explanation. I didn't know why I did those things or why certain things were overwhelming for me. I didn't understand that. And then my meltdowns usually involve me sitting in a corner and rocking. And I remember being told to stop doing that. Don't do that. Um, And because I was conditioned to obey, I listened. And I think that really impacted my stress regulation growing up. And there's cost to that, later in life when you're not able to regulate your stress response as a child, right? Um, so I think masking here for me, it actually has multiple layers in the story, right? Because of my background and because of my personal experiences. And it becomes really challenging for me to tell the story where I'm able to, like disentangle which aspect of the masking I'm doing because it's all encompassing and it's all a part of me and my identity.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at spontaneous responses, but I just wanted to say I really appreciate that answer. And it, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to kind of asking for just one specific aspect or dimension of one's life in a way isn't possible because it probably is so wrapped up with every other aspect and experience.
Oh no, it's
Yeah,
totally fine. And as I talk through my story with you, these are things I'm realizing about myself that um because I compartmentalize. So the question was a compartmentalized question, and I do
mm,
that. I do that too, right? And then as I talk, I realize, whoa, these compartments are actually merging, right? Because of the complex contexts that I'm sharing.
yeah, absolutely. So the next question is, it's written as also a kind of compartmentalized question, but I'd love your thoughts on it more broadly as well. So the initial question is, what changes, if any, would you like to see in the neurodiversity movement or autism research as a whole to basically become less classist? But I also love your thoughts on just becoming more inclusive and accessible in general in any way.
Yeah. I actually really love that the neurodiversity movement have really pushed for people in the academy to use plain language, and that we're seeing more and more journals adopt lay summaries of research articles. I love that so much because forever that many of us have been in the academy are reading research information at a much higher level of our understanding, and that creates a barrier between those in the academy and those outside, right? So with these lay summaries, it's breaking down that wall so we can communicate with one another. So I love that's where the neurodiversity movement is going. Um, and I want to take it a step even further that, for those of us who are in college, we're getting the training, we're learning how to be professionals one day, and that those who are teaching us, who are training as an undergraduate student or a graduate student, um, that we rethink, excuse me, the way we're taught to communicate. A lot of the trainings are still make eye contact when you're giving a presentation, make eye contact when you're, um, like meeting with students or when you're lecturing, uh, reduce stuttering, reduce using, what is it called? Verbal pauses. I think that's what they're called, like like there's a lot of the training and in communication still teach these things. And I understand that when we're speaking to a broad audience, there will be people who are listening who would stop listening to us because we didn't make eye contact. We use and like a lot. I get that. But I think that in the training, it's important to also teach the nuances of when it's okay for us to use those verbal pauses and when it's okay to not make eye contact. That doesn't get taught at all. And the reason why I believe that if we train students in this manner, it actually then implicitly removes the classist view of how professionals are supposed to look like. Because for first generation college students who don't have the privilege of their parents going before them to teach them the ins and outs of what to expect when they're in college and then what to expect after they graduate. They're being taught things by people who have these legacies passed on to their peers. And it's unfair because they have, in a way, a leg up, but the first generation college students are faced with so many barriers as to why is it that I'm supposed to talk this way? My parents didn't talk this way. None of my friends around me talk this way, but I'm told to be a professional, I have to talk this way. I have to present this way. And when they present in their genuine self, they're told they're unprofessional. So I think that's one layer of implicit classism that many people in the academy don't realize. Like it's probably like a subconscious thing. They don't even know. It's unintentional. But I want to bring that up because people probably aren't thinking about that as a classism thing, communication and teaching these things. And I think this also would benefit people with communication disabilities as well, right? We want people with communication disabilities to thrive in college. So if we change the way we teach about communication, the ins and outs, the nuances, it would include people with these disabilities to then succeed and become professionals.
Uh, Absolutely. Yeah, I would love to see those changes being made as well. The next question is a little bit of a jump in topic, but what advice do you have for mental health care professionals who are working with autistic individuals?
I guess I'll bring my experience of when I was diagnosed, and having to navigate that, what it means now that I'm autistic in my mind at the time. So when I told my doctor that I was just diagnosed, the first thing that my doctor said was, okay, let's get you supports right now. And so I started therapy to understand what this diagnosis mean and how to process it. So that happened immediately after I received my diagnosis. Um, I was also diagnosed with depression and anxiety at the same time that I received my autism diagnosis. And so I had to work through those as well. And, I guess I didn't say this in the question that you asked at the beginning about my childhood, adolescence experience. There's a lot of complex trauma that came along with that. So that was a part of my healing with this mental health provider. And I didn't realize that having a neurodiversity affirming mental health provider would be so beneficial for me. And I was so lucky that this therapist was very neurodiversity affirming and walked me through what that meant because I didn't know at the time, like, like how important that was to in the healing process. And so she actually educated me and said, look, here's some resources to learn about mental health providers who are neurodiversity affirming. And when they're not neurodiversity affirming, this is what you're going to get. And so I read those resources, and um, I was very blessed to have her help me through this healing process. And I had to break down all these different pieces of the depression, the anxiety, and the trauma to get to the autism parts of me, because I've masked that part so hard for so long. And the point at which when I was diagnosed, was when I couldn't mask anymore. That mask just had to come down because I did it for so long. And so she helped me process and walk through that. I think it's important that mental health providers who are working with autistic people dealing with mental health issues, which is so commonly co-occurring with those like diagnosed, right? And even those diagnosed early in life because of living in a society that's just not designed for autistic people, for neurodivergent people, you're having to mask a lot. And I think that when a therapist is talking with an autistic person dealing with those things, to recognize that these entangle. And so perhaps maybe compartmentalizing things might not get to the root of the problem. And I don't know what the process would look like with the individuals, where for some, maybe to capture where things are entangled. And then once you figure that part out, then you start to like peel the layers and separate out the pieces to see if that's going to help someone like me figure out the root of that depression, right? The root of that anxiety. And for me, I'd say that's helpful because once I can figure what my triggers are, what the stimulus is that's causing me to experience depressive symptoms or anxiety symptoms, then I can avoid it. Like I can remove that thing out of my life that's making things worse for me, right? But if we talk about the autism parts, we peel the layers and that I can identify the aspects of what is overwhelming me, right? When we talk about the sensory systems, then I can know when I enter into a certain space and protect myself from overwhelming my sensory systems. And I can also learn strategies of communication, social communication. So if I need a break, if I need to, you know, get some personal space so I can self regulate, that I figure out how to communicate that in certain contexts. For me, it's hard to do when I'm in a professional setting. I don't know how to communicate that because I'm afraid of how people are going to judge me if I were to say, make a request a certain way. I think working through how to do that in certain contexts would be helpful for an autistic person. So those are some things that I think would be helpful for hopefully other autistic people seeking therapy.
Absolutely. I really appreciate um, those ideas and hearing your experience. And I'm so glad that you were able to find a good therapist who is neurodiversity affirming. That is definitely so important. The next question is, I think we've touched on this a little bit, but what kind of led up to you realizing that you were autistic, and what was that experience like for you to kind of have that initial realization?
Um, I think the moment that it hit me when um, was when my second son. So I have four kids. Um, my third son. I have four kids. My second son was diagnosed when he was 3 years old, and then my third son was diagnosed when he was 7 years old. And when we went through the evaluation for my third son, when he was 7, I was filling out the questions for him. This was where my husband and we were thinking he could be autistic, but then maybe he's ADHD, maybe it's something else. We weren't completely sure because my third son, his behaviors were so different from our second son, where it was like, oh, he's clearly autistic. We know. There was no question. But for my third son, it was just like, I don't know. And so as I was filling out the evaluations and they did the ADOS, which is the gold standard for interviewing uh, parents and caregivers to figure out if the child is autistic or not. During that process for my third son, the entire time I was just like, wait, what? This this counts as autistic? Because I feel like I'm filling it out for myself. A lot of the questions, especially the questionnaires that involve repetitive, restricted behaviors and interests. I resonated with so much of those questions as I was circling things for my son, being high on a lot of the items. And then when they got to the sensory questions, same thing. And then the social communication questions, I'm like, okay, so if I'm marking all these things, and then uh, when the doctor came back and said, yeah, he's definitely like right there, at the threshold, but I think he's a little bit right above. So he definitely, I would give him the diagnosis. And so now looking back, he's 12 now, but looking back, I actually talked to my son about this. He would kind of laugh about it. He's like, I'm your twin. We're twins. We're so alike. We're the same autism. and and it's yeah, it brings me joy to think about that when I look back. But this was also the same time that I switched my research from studying the general population to autism, and I started to immerse myself in the online community and connected with a lot of autistic people who were like diagnosed, and they told their stories. And through listening and reading their stories of how they discovered they were autistic, I realized, oh, late diagnosis is a thing. I thought this was just childhood, diagnosis experience only. That was how ignorant I was. I didn't know. Um, and when I started to resonate with so many of their stories, that's when I was questioning, I think I might be autistic. And then I read, I think I might be autistic by Cynthia Kim, um, and filled out the questionnaire that she had at the end, and that was it for me. I was like, oh, I'm definitely on the spectrum.
I love the concept of an autism twin. Someone, I guess, like the type of autism. Yeah, that's really neat to hear that you and your son uh, have that in common. Yeah, thank you very much for that answer. The next question is, I guess, tangentially related. I think you shared a bit about the book from Cynthia Kim that was helpful in starting to understand your own autism. If you could travel back in time, I guess to whatever point in time you want, and give yourself a resource or information about uh, autism or neurodivergence, would you? And if so, what would it be?
Because I grew up in a family that did not, I mean, my parents' level of education, the highest was for my mom, an associate's degree. And for my dad, his highest level of education was around eighth grade, ninth grade. Um, they never learned anything about developmental disabilities, mental health, none of the psychology, the stuff we learned in psychology in college. And I think that had I heard this information early in life, that perhaps I would have picked up the signs myself. So my parents, maybe they would not have, but I would have. I would have listened to the lessons and realized that that's me. I recognized myself in the lessons. So I think that when we assume young children wouldn't understand psychology, the lessons that we typically learn in psychology, that includes developmental disabilities. I didn't make the rules. The psychology gods made the rules of including developmental disabilities in the lessons. So, but I think that we're doing a disservice to children by underestimating how much they could understand psychology and the lessons in psychology. I think that they have the capacity to understand this information. They need access to it because there are so many kids like me, right? And back to, sort of the earlier point, children from low SES socioeconomic backgrounds typically don't have access to this information, nor their parents. So they might not recognize these signs in themselves, and the parents either. But if it's taught in school, they could pick this up and bring it back to the parents. and then the parents can bring it back to their doctors, and then the rest is history. But we don't teach this in school to young children. Why not?
I wish we did as well. I think even for those who aren't autistic, it's still going to be beneficial because they can develop closer relationships with their autistic peers, and so on. I'm realizing I actually haven't mentioned at this point yet that you are an autism researcher who does incredible research. Would you be willing to describe some of your research and kind of what got you interested in the topic? And then also, if you were in a world that's kind of a utopia where any research is possible and there's sort of unlimited funding, personnel, whatever else would be needed to make a study possible, what would that dream research study be?
I love this question because I tell a lot of my colleagues that research is my hobby, and I don't get bored doing my hobby all day, every single day, and it happens to be my work. So um, you can probably imagine I don't take breaks very often. And I love talking about research with people. I might turn out away some of my non-scientist friends because I overdo it. So my research during my dissertation focused on the mechanisms of pubertal development that includes the brain and also the body, and how those changes that are happening in young people could impact their mental health outcomes. And we know from like the scientific literature that pubertal development is this sensitive period because if we, like pick one aspect of the change, which are hormones, right? That are changing and also um, resulting in the growth that we're watching kids go through, how that can be a player in mental health illness onset in some teens that plays with or interact with their environment, right? So I was curious in learning that process because of a parent who brought this up at a meeting that I was a part of, um, who had a teenager experiencing puberty and started to notice there are some behavioral issues that the parent hadn't seen before puberty and thought maybe there's some science information that could help this parent figure out how to support their teen. And I thought, surely that exists, right? There's a body of research. No, it didn't. That research was non-existent at the time. This was back in 2017. And so that's when I decided I'm going to investigate this mechanism and figure this out if possible. And then I was funded a pre-doctoral award through the NIH to research this topic for my dissertation. And currently now I'm doing a project. Sorry, another sip of water.
Yeah, no hurry.
Currently now I'm doing a project in my lab where we're looking at puberty. So let me back up a little bit. I pursued this line of research for my dissertation and was comparing between autistic teens and non-autistic teens to see if there would be a difference between pubertal development as a mechanism of influence of mental health outcomes. And because I was working with data that was available at the time, the sample sizes were really small. And not only that, but the measurements that were used in these data sets were also limited. So I really couldn't dig deep into the mechanisms because of the data availability at the time. And so I was able to work with mostly like self-reported pubertal development, parent-reported pubertal development, um, and I was also working with like a single time point of those assessments couldn't answer the question of like, because when we talk about development, we think this is like years incrementing of influence. So observing a single time point isn't really going to tell us all the whole picture, right? So that's what I worked with. And to my surprise, puberty was actually doing something interestingly good for autistic teens. Um, from the single assessment, that it appears to maybe alleviate some of the mental health outcomes I was observing in the data set for autistic teens, but the opposite was happening for non-autistic teens, where puberty was actually a period of things are getting a little bit harder for them. So this is why I think longitudinal data is so essential to disentangle and figure out like what's happening, especially in autism. A lot of this information is available in non-autistic teens, but not in autistic teens. So in my program of research, I want to be able to collect this information longitudinally so then we can figure out what those mechanisms are and bring in the brain. You know that brain development is happening at a very fast pace, right? During pubertal development, it continues all the way till around 25 years old. So I'm hoping to collect this information, of course, if we get funded to do this work, so we can understand the processes of puberty. And at least this will be the starting point for whoever that's studying the lifespan of autism, right? Later in life who want to study menopause, this could be something that we could um, work together on and figuring out those who are focused on menopause because menstruation, menopause, those things could be linked. If I guess in a way that would be my dream project. Like if I had all the funding in the world, it would be to collect longitudinal data on a sample of autistic teens starting at age 8 years old all the way till 25 years old, where they would allow us consent to us scanning their brains and collecting their information on puberty, mental health, and the experience of adolescence. So then we are able to figure out, well, is this a sensitive period in which it's an opportunity for positive youth development? Most of the puberty literature focuses on negative youth development. I know that's not a term, but that's how I read it. It is like these are the negative outcomes that are happening in association to puberty for non-autistic teens, which I think should change for non-autistic teens literature. But I want to look at this from a positive youth development angle for autistic teens.
It would be wonderful to have that very long-term data. And it's fascinating what you found that um, aspects of puberty may be having a more positive impact in autistic individuals relative to non-autistic. So yeah, thank you for explaining some of your research to me. The last couple questions are respectively, what brings you joy in life? I guess speaking of positive outcomes, and what do you most enjoy about being autistic? And then also just if there's anything that you'd like to discuss that I haven't asked, I'd love to hear that as well.
You know, I really enjoy being a mom. Um, it's opened up so much of the way I view the world. Ever since my kids have taught me what it's like to be them. And um, I've been, I know that there have been stories, and I have friends who have had really terrible experiences navigating a world that is not accepting of their children who are autistic. Um, and I've had those too. I've had my fair share of those experiences too. Um, I'm one of those people who tries to count my blessings when I can get them because there's so few. There's so few of those growing up as a child and in my young adult years and in my later adult years that I try to count my blessings as much as I can. And in those blessings, I have met some of the most amazing allies and advocates who love my kids and taught me so much about how to be kind and generous and supportive. And it makes me a stronger and better mom to them because of these individuals. I am still learning what autism really is. I know it's been 5 years that I have been reading the literature on autism and even researching autism. I'm an autism researcher. I'm still learning so much. And that education actually comes from people with more experiences than me interacting with so many autistic people. That's the education that I'm gaining every single day. And that brings me joy because it tells me that the world is open to improving and being a more inclusive space for us to be in it. Um, and it gives me hope that my children are going to grow up in a world that have people who will stand by them and will support them. Not everybody, but there are people who exist in this world who will be there for them. And that gives me joy and hope um, because there's so few of those that we can hang on to in a very, lots are happening. The world is burning. So these are things that I try to count as blessings. Um, and ever since I shared my autism diagnosis openly with the public, this is on the internet. People can find me that way and realize, oh, she's autistic. Um, that was a decision I made with my kids and with my husband. Prior to making that decision, I was very private and I don't like attention. I try to wade attention away um, because it can be overwhelming. But because I've talked with people who said, I don't know very many Asian autistic people who are professionals because I've heard that over and over. I was already sort of like, I did my PhD. I'm gonna keep working to become a professional. I'm already a professional, early career. I can do this. I could be that person. I could share openly with people. Maybe I could be one face. Um, so I talk with my kids, I talk with my husband. They all know now, like, you know, they know me as mommy and as Jenny, but they also get to know me as a public, facing person too. And that has been so rewarding to meet people who are afraid to share or disclose their autism who are Asian. And I've met so many people who would share their stories with me and want more representation of Asian autistics in the professional space. So I'm hoping that that will change. If I could be a helping hand in changing that representation, the underrepresentation problem that we have, then I'm there.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I really appreciate the work that you do, and I also appreciate your time in sharing your experiences and insight and hope. So thank you. Yeah, thank you again for the opportunity to interview you.
Thank you, Sam. This has been fun.